In this podcast, William Franciette of Threatscape schools me in all things automation in Microsoft and security. We dive into DevSecOps, managed identities and Entra and Azure, Defender for Cloud and how that integrates with Azure DevOps to produce secure apps. And we also chat about the monthly Microsoft 365 Security and Compliance User Group that William organizes with myself. So let's get going. So William, what's the main reason that folks need to start caring about managing their security and infrastructure as code and automating stuff?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think I will go back by the history of why I started using script and coding. So basically, it's instead of using the portal and the user interface and doing the same thing over and over, and often when you type or when you try to just fill a form, there is always typos and there is always things that you forget or you don't do it in a consistent manner. So that's really one of the reasons why I started to learn scripting and coding, because a bit of laziness as well, just things takes time and I don't like to do the same thing over and over. So that's one of the reasons, really the main reason why I started coding. I find it fun and it really saves you a lot of time as well. So it takes time to learn, but as soon as you learn it, then it saves you a lot of time. And just to run a script takes you a few seconds. If you had, for example, to create a user account or anything like that, that will take you 5-10 minutes. With a script, you run it, 10 seconds, all done. You can start to shift to something else. So in terms of time management, consistency, reducing typing errors, and my main reason for that.
So it's fun, it saves you time, and it improves your accuracy, right? So I guess going on that basis, it's kind of like, well, why wouldn't you do this, right? So what are some of the perceptions, at least, about why folks maybe don't get into automating stuff, right? Because there's always that baggage, that history of, hey, I'm just going to open up Active Directory users and computers, and I'm going to create my user the old-fashioned way. Or maybe if it's something I do all the time in 365, maybe I'm not interested in using Graph, right? I go through the UI and do it that way. What are some of the maybe misconceptions about reasons folks would not go down the route of automating things in 365 and in Windows?
Because it's scary. That big phrase that you can break everything. We all know, for example, delete all the users or anything like that. But with the right guardrail, you can really start to process and making sure that you don't impact the whole estate. So going slowly, really crawl, walk, run. That will be always the way to manage things.
And so when it comes to that, being folks scared to break something, obviously you've done some pretty advanced stuff with automation. You've done work on M365 DSC and the likes. How do you go out your way to make sure that this? I know this definitely works before I hit that big scary button and I don't kill my whole tenant, right? What are the guardrails that you use?
The main guardrail is test 1,000 times before. It's not because something works that it's the full solution. So testing takes actually more time than just developing and deploying. Testing is one of the main task when we do something, to make sure, because you need to think about all scenario possible. So if there's a typo, if there is something that impact and that you didn't think about it. So there's always logs. So when you create test process, you can start to put your thoughts down and, okay, what happened if I do this? And what happened if I do this action? And having that accumulation of action, that helps really, and that makes a good script that you can use for long term. The more you test, the more your script will be how can I say that? You will be able to use the same script for a long period of time without modifying, without amending it.
Right. So you're thinking of everything that could go wrong in a script and then accounting for that in the actions the script might take. So is that, again, not having a programmer background, that's like what, exception handling, stuff like that? Is that the kind of idea?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Cool.
Exception handling.
And in terms of
and having the right value as well. So sometimes you could have some silly things, like you think that you should put a string, so a character, but that's a number, and that can create errors in the background, this kind of thing. So sometimes you may run an API command and it results as an error, and you don't really know why, because there is some policies in the background that you don't have access to. So these kind of things may happen. So that's why you can't just write the code without testing it. So test takes a lot.
Okay, and if I wanna do that testing, what are the tools and processes to do that properly? Because in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, okay, well, I can think of everything that might go wrong, but there's gonna be stuff that just never occurred to me, and therefore I don't test it, right? So what's your approach, your methodology, and your tools to help you iron all that stuff out?
Yeah, so I will talk about PowerShell because that's what I know the most. And for that, I use Pester. So Pester is like a pseudocode where you can pretend to run a function, but that function will just return some value without running it, so that you can start to create use cases and see if that's the expected outcome. So that's one. And then it's just to run the function or to run the script in a test environment and see if the outcome again is expected or if it's different. So with Pester, you will run it in a very flat environment where you don't contact the API, you don't need even to need an internet connection or anything like that. When you test it in your test environment, that's where you can see the return or the outcome of the API. Is the API accepting your command, or if there is anything? So there is different tests. So, and also the deployment. So when you test it yourself, because you know your code, you have a bit blind spotted because that's your code, and you may have things that you didn't think about. So always have other people with you to test that script. When you deploy something, always have beta testers that they will try your script and see if that results as expected.
Right.
We're only human at the end of the day, so we already always limit, especially when you code something, you're already focusing what you're doing. So there's a lot of things that you won't think about.
And so I get, if I want to get started using something like Pester, because we'll put it this way, when I started using PowerShell a long time ago now, when I go through the learning process and I'd be watching videos on Pluralsight and things like that, Pester never came up, right? So how can folks get started using Pester? Is this just like a module you download, or what's the actual step-by-step process to get up and running with that?
Exactly. So they do have a community, and they have a quite exhaustive website where you can download the module and see some source code and see some tests and learn how it works. Really, you have the full documentation.
Cool. And one of the other things you mentioned is the idea of having other folks test out your code and things like that. And maybe this brings me on to one of the other things I wanted to discuss with you, which is DevOps. In the Microsoft world, that might be Azure DevOps, but there's other tools and things out there. What is, for the lay person, which I basically mean by me, for the dummies who've never really gotten into DevOps, or it's always been that thing that you hear about, and again, a while back, it felt like every sysadmin was eventually going to become a DevOps engineer or something like that. And I don't know if that quite happened, but it's not going anywhere. So when we talk about DevOps, specifically, what do we mean by that, right? What's the advantages of it, and what is the actual core definition of this?
Yeah, DevOps is quite very large meaning. So that comes initially from the Agile methodology, and then that move towards DevOps. So that's basically coding. If I want to come back to Pester and how to learn how to, even without knowing the whole DevOps culture, you could just start to collaborate and start to participate in open source projects. So for example, I wanted to be a bit more involved in the community, so I started to participate in M365, Microsoft 365 DLC project, and that's how I learned about Pester, how I learned about a bit more about DevOps. So like what you mentioned about having a team that works. So working with people that are more advanced than you, that you learn a lot from them. So that's how really I learned. In terms of DevOps is has a large meaning. There's many books and many, how can I say that? It's a whole process it's basically a continuous development of testing and implementing and deploying. And it's not only in coding. DevOps has been the meaning. I've seen even teams using Agile and DevOps mentality or approach while they don't do any coding as well. So they use that in a day-to-day work. So basically, they will have a sprint, and they will have, for example, they will set a number of tasks for 2 weeks or for a month, and they will follow that program, and they will have a daily briefing, and everyone will start to tell all the team together where they are, what's the blockers, and this kind of thing. So that's more about a mentality rather than just to be coding specific.
Right. Okay. So I guess that is to say that the DevOps, it's an approach and a style of operating rather than anything specifically technical. Is that fair to say?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Cool. And so you then get tools like Azure DevOps, right? Which I guess they take that philosophy and like codify it, help you manage it. Is that?
Yeah.
But what's the advantage then? Why should, if I'm maybe a sysadmin and I want to start automating things, I just go dive straight into DevOps, or what's the best approach there?
So Azure DevOps is built of multiple modules. So earlier we spoke about test. It's one of the module in DevOps. You can use as well your repo. So the repository is a bit like, it's like GitHub. GitHub also is a repository. So that's another module where you can have your source code and have it versioned. So you can have the same code, but having some backups. If there is something wrong, you can revert back to a previous version. You have as well your agile, and that's the sprint and the board where you have your task items and having your team organization in DevOps. And you have also your pipeline, so anything that is automation. So all those modules are available in Azure DevOps. So you have teams working with Azure DevOps, teams working with GitHub, teams working with Jira, for example. You have multiple platforms you can use from.
Okay, right.
And often teams use multiple tools as well, so it's not unique to.
Right, so I'm probably not just going to use Azure DevOps. There will be a number of tools that I'm using in conjunction with that. Right. And so on the point about the modular nature of Azure DevOps, you mentioned that you've got testing abilities, you've got your repo, and then you I just want to clarify that difference then. So you've got your board, which is that like for planning then, the kind of the logistics of things, and then the pipeline is the automation. So how does, I guess, again, coming at this as a bit of a dummy, board and pipeline, what's the specific differences between those?
So the board will be used to organize your team. So often you will have a Scrum Master, or the one could be the project manager that will organize the team and delegate tasks, etc. The pipeline is more in terms of technical, so where you want to, for example, you have your code you want to deploy into your test environment, and then from your test environment you want to deploy it to production, or these kind of things. So you can also integrate other tools like what was called Defender for DevOps, now is DevSecOps. They have an add-on that you can deploy there. You could have as well code analysis. So for example, the pester that we mentioned earlier, you can integrate that in your pipeline. So you can slowly move, we call that shift left. So moving all the tests before release. So having as much as tests as possible before releasing even in test environment to have a certain quality of code. So for example, making sure you don't have secrets or passwords in your code, these kind of things, making sure that your code is not vulnerable to known exploit like code injection and this kind of thing. So you do online that you can integrate to your pipelines to make a strong quality code.
Right. Okay. That helps clarify things a lot for me. And one of the things you mentioned there, and I'm assuming this is where we're going at the end of it, in the pipeline you're automating things, and you mentioned how that can integrate with Defender for Cloud, which has a component that used to be called Defender for DevOps, now it's just called DevOps Security. Hopefully I'm keeping up here. So I guess that's the component that does the things you mentioned in your pipeline, where it can inspect for plain text secrets and other types of vulnerabilities. And so I guess that's obviously not going to be free, right? So this is a paid add-on for Defender for Cloud that integrates with DevOps. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So that's an additional plan that you can enable. I think there's a small portion of it is free, but I need to verify that.
Okay. And that's does that replace the need for like app pen testing and things like that? I'm assuming it doesn't, but where does it what are the core benefits of it then, other than finding secrets and things like that?
Yeah, it won't replace it, that's for sure. It's really that mentality of shift left. Before releasing your code, you want to make sure it is in a good state. Pen tests will come when your code is finished, and then you have someone that try to enforce to see if it's strong enough. So that really make your code stronger before the pen tester comes and try to break the door.
Right, understood. So it's kind of like, I hope I don't butcher this analogy, but my brain thinks in analogies. Kind of like how if I've got a CSPM tool for AWS or for Google or for Microsoft 365, that helps me, quote unquote, shift left as far as I identify the misconfigurations before I then go and run a pen test or before someone actually breaches me. Defender for DevOps,
Exactly.
not what it's called anymore, achieves the same idea. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, I gotcha. And so with Defender for, I keep calling it Defender for DevOps. That's old habits die hard and all that. That kind of stuff, I guess. Does that, what would you say, that happens after the development of the code rather than when I'm actually writing the code? So again, these are all probably silly questions, but if I'm in like Visual Studio or something like that, it's not going to help there and say, hey, you made a mistake in your code there. It will do it after it through the pipeline process.
So you onboard your environment, so your GitHub or Azure DevOps or even GitLab to Defender for cloud. And then from there, you will start to get some recommendations, like the CSPM recommendation. And then you deploy one of the small modules in your pipeline to make sure that you have a code analysis that is running during your deployment.
Okay, I get you. I'm with you now. And once my code is up there and hosted and I've got my apps and things like that, Defender for Cloud obviously has all these different workload protections, how it can target things like app services and things like that, I believe. But in addition to that, you have to contend with the identity, pardon me, jumping on my words there, you have to contend with the identity security, right? And Entra has this concept of managed identities, and it can get quite confusing for folks because they're not user objects, right? But we're still calling them identities. What's the primary use case for these managed identities, and how do they improve the security of services folks are hosting in Azure?
So identity are the magical tools to me. They're just awesome. Reason being, you don't need to manage your authentication anymore. Before manage identity, to authenticate your pipeline or you would need an app ID and a secret, or an app ID and a certificate. With managed identity, you can link the two platforms together and have authentication proofed and approved without depending on a password or depending on a secret or depending on a certificate. So the gain in security and even just in terms of how smooth you can process that, it's a great benefit.
Great.
I was even hearing yesterday, actually, I was in the user group and one of the presenters now has demonstrated how to use managed identity between clouds. So even between GCP, so Google Cloud Platform, and Azure DevOps, they use a managed identity to do the authentication between the two. And for example, you could use that to have a backup in another cloud or for resiliency or anything like that. It was impressive. It was impressive.
So I'm furiously taking notes here. And what you're saying to me, I'm kind of thinking like this, I think you said like magic, right? It's like, so I don't need to worry about secrets. I don't need to worry about certificates. Those are conventionally your two primary ways of handling authentication and things like that, right? So what's the gotcha, right? Is there any limitation here? Like where might I trip and fall on this kind of thing? Or is it really just that easy?
So I have a good example for that. With Azure Arc, for example, you can deploy Azure Arc on one of your servers and deploy a managed identity to it. So that means that any script that runs from that server can authenticate against your workload. So here the gotcha would be, okay, you have that easy authentication, but you need to make sure that your server is safe. So it slowly becomes like a tier 0 ready if you think of it, because it could have great power. So you need to make sure that you don't overprivilege that managed identity. So you don't give it a directory read write or anything like that. That you need to make sure that you really use the least privilege and really monitor the activity. So maybe using conditional access workload and identity or anything like that to make sure that you can control what is done. So as soon as you start to use managed identity on, for example, a server or anything like that, you need to monitor sign-ins or other privileged applications and anything like that.
And so, like, geez, under the hood, right? Is it kind of like just using certificates under the hood and it's abstracting that away from me so I never have to touch them? Or Is it a little bit right? Okay, so that's what's going on.
But you don't need to manage renewal as well. So that's
right. Okay, so it
not so
goes on for as long as in the example you gave, it would go on for the lifetime of that server object, right?
Exactly.
And so
one gotcha though on this is your managing identity has an ID. So if that managed identity gets removed, you don't have a backup. So you have to do the setup again. So that's something that you need to keep in mind.
And so again, just on understanding this properly, I think back to, I would say the good old days, but frankly, it's still a perfectly fine way of doing stuff, is let's say I've got Windows Server. It's got Task Scheduler on it, and I got some PowerShell scripts that I run in Task Scheduler. And let's just say, for example, every night it creates users or it reassigns something to do with Exchange or Entra. Now, typically under that scenario, I'd be working with the graph and I'd be authenticating with the graph and things like that. And an old way of doing that might be, if I don't have managed identities, it might be that I've got a secret codified in my PowerShell script or something like that. And I just want to clarify exactly, with these managed identities, the server and the managed identity, it would completely remove the need for that, right? Just by the very nature of that script running on the device, it would handle all authentication. Yeah, right.
So that's a device authentication if you want.
Yep. Wow. Okay, that's kind of mind-boggling. And I guess in terms of what would you say, the repercussions on that, it just helps, to use your phrase, shift left insofar as I'm reducing, am I reducing my attack surface because I've got less secrets and stuff and keys, but also to your point, I now got to maybe worry more about the endpoint security, right? Because, if I'm not doing the right thing and have OpenRDP or some crazy stuff like that, adversary gets on that box, they now get all the permissions that managed identity has. That's what you're saying.
Exactly. Because that's been built for unattended. So it doesn't look at who is logged in on the servers. It just runs. So it's like a device context, not a user context. So the permission that the user doesn't, it could be just a standard users that just start to log in on that server and run script or anything like that. So that's something you need to watch out. So having a good control of who is allowed to log in, having all those machines needs to be really restricted and monitored.
Okay. And the types of permissions that I can give it, if I think to, if I'm looking at application objects within Entra, I can hand over API permissions. I can even assign them Entra roles and things like that. Is it the same idea with managed identities? Same type of permissions?
Everything you can. You can create tags in Defender, you can create users, applications, you can assign roles, you can do everything. Everything that you can do in the portal, you can do even more with the APIs.
Right, understood. And I'll tell you what, so one of the things that I use in my example is I got PowerShell scripts running on a Windows server, just using Task Scheduler, right? The way that we've been able to do it for an awful long time. I'm also aware that Azure itself has a lot of resources and capabilities that maybe take away the need to do that, right? So off to the top of my head, I'm looking at kind of things I've written down as we've been going. There's things like Azure Automation, there's functions, there's logic apps, and even on the 365 side of things, there's Power Automate, previously called Flow, and things like that. What's the main use cases for moving to that model, right? So rather than maybe if I've got that box that sits in Azure and it just runs away running task scheduler entries, at what point do I start looking at something like Azure Automation and say, actually, this is better than that other way of doing it?
In my opinion, it depends on your target. So what do you want to modify? If it's just cloud resources, then you can use Azure Automation and it will be safer because your standard users can't access it. And it will be also, you don't need to manage the machine itself. You don't need to restart it and this kind of thing. I would use Azure Arc or these kind of things to use on-premise servers when I need to have an on-premise footprint. So for example, I want to query Active Directory. I need to use, that's what I would use. Or for example, even having some integration with SCCM, I could start to query SCCM and then send it to the cloud. So that will be my getaway between the on-premise and the cloud.
Right. So the tipping point is kind of how much am I reliant on-prem AD or something like that for whatever job I'm trying to automate and run. Right. Okie dokie. And again, so I think of that big buzzword list of all the things in Azure that can help me automate stuff. And Azure Functions comes up a lot, right? And I know folks use it in SaaS and all this type of stuff. What's the use case for that, and when should I be interested in that?
So Azure Function is, so you do have Azure Automation that you can run PowerShell and Python. So that's a great solution for even you can run DSCs and workflows and these kind of things. And Azure Function is a bit more, it's a bit larger. So you can use C#, JavaScript, TypeScript, and PowerShell and these kind of things. So that they're two different solutions really. Often you will use Azure Function to respond to an event. So if you have an event hub or anything like that, you can respond to event. Azure Automation would be more automating scripts really. So it depends.
Okay, understood. And I'll tell you what, one other, maybe the last thing I want to talk to you about is you mentioned when we were talking about workload identities, well, specifically managed identities, that there was a session on it just in the monthly Microsoft 365 Security and Compliance User Group, sponsored by Threatscape and a couple other folks who we're very grateful for. You've recently become involved as an organizer in that. What's the, if folks are interested, what is the Microsoft 365 Security and Compliance User Group and why should folks attend?
That's a user group that runs online. We don't have in-person events at the moment. Really, the scope is very wide, so we could speak about any Microsoft 365 platforms, mainly security and compliance, but we will speak about Entra, about so many different subjects, Defender, all the Defender suite, and we do have very great guests, most of them MVPs, but anyone can join and submit a session, and we always choose those subjects that we know that will be quite unique as well. Like, for example, the session yesterday, we had Nara that gave us an overview of how to link two clouds together. And before that, we had Luis as well give us a good overview of incident response. How do we respond to event and how do we make sure we protect and we organized and we are ready when something happens. So it really depends. We have 2 sessions a month. So last Wednesday of every month.
Good stuff. Yeah, no, folks, definitely need to check that out because, I mean, I'll speak for myself. I do this stuff. Well, you and I both do this stuff 9 till 5. Probably more than 9 till 5, actually, if I'm being honest, every single day. And in these monthly user groups, we always learn stuff, right? It's kind of amazing what you find out of these things, that what you don't know and what you never even thought about, right? So, for example, the federation between these 2 different clouds for managed identities, that's 99% of people that would... The need for that would never occur, but I guess when you then start seeing it, it's like, oh, hey, I could use this in my environment to do this, that, and the other thing, right?
And it's actually more often that you think. So many people have started in a cloud and then they start to move to another. So they may need that gateway between the two. I think that was very relevant. Seen many customers that they use multi-cloud, even if they're not really advanced into it, they still use it. So that could be a great ease and simplify the management of those two clouds.
Awesome, good stuff. I'll tell you what, we're going to wrap it up now. If folks want to find you online, obviously they need to search and find the beard. There's a thing. There was a running joke that like everyone I work with has this enormous beard.
That's a prereq.
Yeah, it's a prerequisite. Where can folks find you online to connect with you?
So I'm mostly active on LinkedIn and I'm also on Twitter. So William Franciette. I'm trying to blog as well. So I have a blog when I have time to finish. I've got many articles started, but I don't finish them. So
awesome.
We'll get there.
And in terms of the kind of stuff that you blog about and write about, I guess all the sort of stuff we've been talking on the show, right? DevOps,
exactly.
automation, that kind of stuff.
DevOps, security, Intune, endpoint management, a bit of everything, really.
Awesome. Love it. Well, listen, it was fantastic having you on the show. Obviously, it was a pleasure. We talk to each other every single day at work anyway, and obviously through organizing the user group. But no, you've really helped clarify for me a lot of the fundamental questions around DevSecOps and stuff like that, right? So really appreciate your time and thank you for hanging out.
My pleasure.
Good stuff.
Take care.